Okay, and we're gonna go live now. You are good to go.
Okay. It just looks really weird on the screen because usually everybody's really big. So first of all, I just want to welcome everyone. I know it's a Saturday, and depending on where you are and where you're listening, it's actually a really beautiful day. But fortunately, like we'll be roughly about an hour and a half, and that should give you plenty of time to still enjoy a beautiful day. And the sun right now is becoming very powerful. So even if it's a little bit windy, it's still going to be beautiful. So I wanted to welcome everyone to this session today, and I will introduce our guests, which we're really lucky to have. But first, I just wanted to I guess acknowledge land, however one constructs this, in I'm thinking about kind of where we are, because most viewers and myself and even our guests are in different places. But thinking about land as having its own agency, thinking about people as being part of land. So just wanting people to just think about where they are and who they have relationships with, what the relationship to the land is, to where they are, the people that were there, the ancestors, whether they were your ancestors or not, and how they cared for those territories. And also acknowledging although I'm not a big fan of saying non-human because it just creates a binary that I always sort of squirm every time I hear myself saying that, but also all those other entities and beings that also form part of the world that we live in that could be unique to the place that you are and the lands that you are. But also to think about the future, like the past, but also the current peoples that are there, and also the future and what that might mean. And often I ask people just to think about what kind of ancestor they want to be in the places that they have responsibilities to take care of. I think it's relevant to today's session, and a lot of our guests today spend their career and their lives trying to take care of where we are for future generations and for all life. So I'm greatly appreciative of that. So that's kind of how I like to do my acknowledging of land. And it's I'm not a big fan of scripts. So we'll just, but I do want people to think about where they are and kind of what the day is like where they are. You can send that in the chat if you want, so everyone else can kind of get a sense of who's listening and viewing today. So I'm Deborah Mcgregor, and I am at York University at the moment. I'm Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, which is near Manitoulin Island, or some people might know it as Birch Island. And a lot of my work, similar to my guests, but in different ways, has been about trying to figure out how we navigate, negotiate ourselves in the world that we live in right now in order to be able to, I guess, protect, I would say land or environment, but it's actually much broader than that, right? For future generations and for people who are here now, and in honoring our ancestors as well. So that means I spent a lot of time thinking about traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, how we think about that, how that can form the foundation of moving forward. I guess that's probably the best way to describe the kind of work that I'm doing, and more recently becoming very interested in the role of Indigenous languages in that work as part of the foundation for moving forward. So this session is part of a series of where we're wanting to just have conversations with people who engage in this work and who inspire others, because they in turn have been inspired, and I'll ask them that, like who's been your inspiration, describe the work that you do, and where do you see the future going. A bit on Ben's book, if you haven't read it. Great book. I love this book, and the guests were all involved in the production of this wonderful piece of work. I'll just do this more slowly so you can actually see it. But it's also on the poster, and maybe Dali or JC can send that information out, more information out to folks, and we'll do that through the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project. But it's basically just to have conversations again with people and what their motivation is and where they kind of see things heading in based on their own experience. The other part of it is what makes this really interesting, because this book that I'll keep waving around, because it has a really nice picture on it too, is or image on it too, is that it was based on research. It was part of Jen's PhD, Dr. Gobby's PhD, and so she engaged in the research process that I found really impressive. So I'm hoping that there's actually people in my Indigenous research class today, because what's really amazing about today is Jen produced the work, but two people who are instrumental in who she talked to and was inspired by in the production of are here. So you have like the researcher and the people who are part of the research. So that's, I'm not even sure if I've ever been in a conversation like that before. So I want to explore that a little bit more, because I think, a lot of people want to engage and work with Indigenous peoples, but they're not necessarily sure about how to go about doing that in ways that are actually going to benefit the overall objective or main goal of why people are engaged in this work in the first place. So that makes it exciting for me to have that opportunity. So, so I'm just going to then describe Jen. I think you prefer that, or you want to be Dr. Gobby.
Jen is good.
Yeah, I'm just Jen. Yeah. So, he's an activist scholar, a postdoctoral researcher now at Concordia in Abenaki territory in rural Quebec, so must be beautiful there. She's founder of the Mud Girls Natural Building Collective. Hopefully we can hear a little bit more about that. An organizer of Climate Justice Montreal, completed her PhD at McGill in 2019, is now, again, I mentioned postdoc at Concordia University, but she's also engaged in work with Indigenous climate action. And actually the proceeds, she can talk about this a bit more, but the proceeds of the book go to Indigenous climate action to help with their work. And we also have Jaydene. She's a Two-Spirit Michif-Cree woman currently living in District 1 Spoon territory, or Hamilton, Ontario, I guess to be more Google Map precise. She spends most of her efforts on anti-extractive and land defense struggles, but also has dedicated herself to defending Hamilton against gentrification, fighting patriarchy inside and outside of organizing circles, and pushing for animal liberation. So, so she's awake for 24 hours to devote herself to do all of this. So I'm glad she's doing this work. And Sakej, or I guess maybe another, James Ward might be another way of he's known as. He's of the Wolf Clan, Mi'kmaq, from, okay, you're gonna have to introduce this. I didn't ask before how to say Mi'kmaq word, but I'll say Burnt Nation. In Brunswick, he holds a bachelor's degree in political science and master's in Indigenous Governance. He has a long history of advocating and protecting First Nations inherent responsibilities and freedoms. So so I'm just really honored to have all three of them here to be in conversation with you. So with that, what I thought I would do is just, have you reflect upon. So I'm always very interested in what kind of motivates people. Like, how do you get people motivated? Who was the inspiration? Was it like grandmothers? Was it a relative? Was it like what inspired you to engage in this work? So so I'm really interested in, I think, others as well, and how you see it. Well, we'll get to that later, how you see it kind of playing out, but how you got to where you are now. So maybe we could start with you, Jen, and then I'll just go by my screen because I'm governed by who appears on my screen in what order in these days. So, and then we'll go to Sakej and then Jaydene. So Jen, whenever you're ready.
Okay, sure. So thank you for organizing this. It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited to have more conversation with Sakej and Jaydene. They were extremely formative in the research. I had long conversations with them both during the research and quoted them both very heavily in the book, as anyone who's read the book will know. So it's really exciting to be talking about these things with them. It's an ongoing conversation. So how I got to be here. So I've been concerned about the climate crisis for about 20 some odd years. And at first I approached it by sort of going back to the land and living off the grid in a rural island in BC and learning to grow food and, build eco housing and that kind of thing. And that felt really powerful, but it also felt really disconnected because as crisis was getting worse, emissions were going up. I was like, I need to figure out how to contribute in a more powerful way. And so then I did a term in the local government in BC on the Islands Trust and was an Islands trustee and tried to do that through government and found that extremely frustrating and but worked on some climate things there. And then it was around that point that I realized it's time for me to figure out how to be able to formulate argument and gather evidence so I can convince people of my strong feelings about that stuff. So that's when I started, I went back to school, returned to Montreal, Kanien'kehá:ka territory where I was born, and went to McGill, started my undergrad at age 35, studied, got a BA in environment, and then went straight into the PhD. And by the end of my undergrad, I was so full up to here with understanding the crises, like understanding how bad the crises were, but had learned very little about, okay, what do we do about it? How do you transform systems away from extraction, exploitation towards something just and, ecologically sustainable? So I decided to spend the PhD working on that, trying to unpack that. And I was really feeling at that time that the most powerful force for transformation I was seeing in so-called Canada was anti-pipeline Indigenous land defense movements and the climate justice movement. So I decided to spend those years talking to folks active in those movements and thinking together. And so my worldview completely transformed during those years of talking to so many people, including Sakej and Jaydene. And so taken huge inspiration from the folks on the front line and continue to struggle to figure out how to use research in ways that's actively supportive to the front lines, people on the front lines of extractivism and climate impacts, in a way that's reciprocal, it gives back. And I'm still, not haven't figured it out, but I'm continuing to learn. And so yeah, my main inspiration are folks on the front lines and figuring out how to use the skills I have to support that. So that's how I got here and who I'm inspired by. Maybe I'll pass it over to Sakej.
Let me tackle the word that you're trying to pronounce. My community, it's Esgenoopetitj, and that's a lot of people know it as Burn Church First Nation. Actually, like mine comes from a very long story, and it's really cool because it's like one of those pivotal moments in life that completely changes you. And for me, I can really say it was like a 180. And I'll really summarize it. I believe it was the summer of 92, 93, 92. I got out of the American military. I was the perfect, like the poster child for assimilation. I had previously served with the Canadian military. I joined the American military. My life was just about this kind of military, pursuing a career and such, right? So I was really the assimilated person that would promote colonialism completely. And then after getting out of the military, I was gonna go and get my degree and then go back and get into drug enforcement. That kind of was my plan until there was a conflict, a small little conflict outside of my community. It was a neighboring my community. And my uncle, who had been part of the Warrior Society, asked me, can you come in and give me some advice? You got all that military background. Can you provide something? I said, yeah, sure. And I did it more as a favor for my uncle. But after really putting in effort, I really sat, I think I gave a 3-hour briefing on how to improve the procedures and tactics that were being used by the Warrior Society to defend this small community. I really started to think about this idea, how did I just find myself on the other side of the fence? I'm looking, it was both a metaphor and a realistic kind of condition, because I was looking just outside of there and there was the RCMP set up against my people. And it planted the seed of doubt in my head, because I started questioning, what's the real nature of the state and the Mi'kmaq Nation? Like, what is this all about? Why do my people have to go through such extraordinary efforts to just fish out of what really amounts to like, it was basically like a creek. I won't call it a river, it was so small. You know, what is that kind of relationship and what does it look like? And I went through this 7-year painful journey of decolonization because I had to swing from one side of the pendulum all the way to the other. So after that, I emerged as a person who is just as resolute, have as much conviction in my belief system, but now it wasn't for the colonizer. Because at that time, that's what drove me to do well in the military. It was this conviction that I thought I was doing the right thing. But after having gone through a decolonial experience in my life, I now was felt like I was guided in this path of what we call smugness, which is Mi'kmaq warrior. And that has shaped my life since '93. And to this day, that's still my work. I engage in places where warrior societies are involved in. I do a lot of advising to Indigenous activist groups and anybody involved in resistance. And I pass on lessons learned, whether they're good or bad. You know, some things we did right, some things we did wrong, as well as kind of this military understanding of how to approach Indigenous resistance. And that's been my work since '93.
So kind of a flashpoint experience that where you literally can point to the exact time and then where the almost like where a crisis sort of creates a transformation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah. Thank you. Jaydene.
I had kind of a funny upbringing in the sense that yeah, when my mom and dad got together, my dad was this like young Métis guy from Saskatchewan. My mom's family was a fairly like wealthy white family from BC, and when they decided to get married and have kids, my mom's family was like very sad about it, and a combination of that tension being like a very real thing, and also my dad having like a lot of really bad experiences growing up in Saskatchewan. He decided to take this opportunity that he got to take a job in the Middle East. And so he actually moved our whole family there from when I was about 5 to when I was about 15 or 16. And so I would come home to Canada about like once a year, sometimes less. And we would do this like cross country tour of like visiting all the relatives. And like every time we'd go through Saskatchewan, my grandpa and my grandma, like it was so important to them that we like go to see all the sites and like go and visit all the family members. And yeah, but I definitely grew up feeling like by the time I moved back to Canada, I always knew that like I was Indigenous or like I was an Indian or something, but I never really like knew what that meant and no context to it. And I had a really hard time, like as a young person, moving kind of in the middle of your social life. And so, yeah, there's a lot of alcoholism in my family, and my mom and dad split up shortly after that. I spent a good number of years just kind of getting it up to trouble and not really doing anything very good with my life. But I always kind of had this feeling like maybe I wanted to like be an activist or something, and I wasn't really like sure what that meant or like who those people were or anything like that. And I think there were like several kind of pivotal moments that I witnessed like on the news or on social media that like I started getting involved in that. One was like the G20 protest in Toronto. And I was just like so shocked that like something like that could like happen in Canada. Also like watching the like 2006 like the Caledonia the Six Nations disputes over like Douglas Creek Estates or like Anastado. And I eventually was in this like pretty abusive relationship, but moved out to Ontario with this guy. And after 5 years, split up with him and kind of just ended up in Hamilton. And I was just really determined at that point that I was going to just like get involved in all of this stuff and like figure it out. And I just went pretty like head in a lot of ways. Like look back and I think it's really funny that a lot of people didn't have more like suspicions of me or something, just being this like 20 something kid who was like, I just wanna like get involved in all this legal stuff and like whatever. And I had like no family and like seemingly came out of nowhere. But yeah, it was kind of a hard road, and for the first part of it, like I felt pretty displaced. I was in university and I had this good friend that I ended up meeting named Sean. Used to be involved in a lot of the I Don't Know More stuff in Kitchener-Waterloo area. And he was really awesome to me, and he really helped. And kind of the first thing that I was back then, I was a vegan and was like trying to get involved in all this like animal liberation stuff, which is actually still something that's really dear to my heart. It's just something that it's a community I can't be a part of anymore because of anti-Indigenous racism. But kind of like one of the first things I ever ended up doing was I was having coffee with Sean one day, and he pointed out to me that there was a statue of John A. Macdonald that had kind of like sprung up overnight on our campus. And he was like, yeah, I can't believe the school is going to like commission all these statues. And anyway, I found out that the school was intending on putting up like 26 or however many life-size bronze statues of every single Canadian prime minister all over the campus and create this like walking tour. And I was just appalled. And that was kind of like one of the first things that I was so upset by it. And I was like, this just can't happen. I like fought really hard and found a few other students who wanted to do something about it with me. And we ended up winning that. And those statues they're not on that campus. And the John A. Macdonald statue was taken down. And that was kind of like my first big win, you know? It was also one of the first struggles that I took part in where I kind of found a voice as like an Indigenous person, and that really, it was actually really difficult for me to speak on that, and that kind of sent me down this like years-long journey to like go back to Saskatchewan, to like reconnect with my grandparents, to meet all of the family that I had there, to like really like take in the stories. And I got to meet like a lot of really amazing people while I was there, including like Maria Campbell. And yeah, I think by the time I came back, I had like a much better idea of who I was and where I came from. And yeah, I threw myself into a lot of land defense. And at that point, the like anti-pipeline struggles in Ontario were really like just bumping and like kicking off. And so that was pretty nonstop for a couple of years. And some of the really like best and most inspiring days, I feel like in the last few years, the like direct anti-pipeline struggle has really faded in Ontario. You know, and during that process, I also had a lot of experiences that shaped me politically. Like there was a period of a few years where a bunch of us were supporting the Chippewa of the Thames First Nation Supreme Court challenge against Line 9. And we raised a lot of money for that. And we like campaigned pretty hard, and they lost that Supreme Court challenge in the end. And additionally, some of the people who I was really close to, or that we were really close to in support of that, like ended up taking positions on band council and kind of dropped the issue entirely. And it was definitely like a formative moment for me in terms of like kind of deciding that like the courts and political positions are just like not the things that are going to make change. And I think that really shaped a lot of my politics of what I would call like in Indigenous anarchism, or like anarchism generally. And yeah, and so I've continued to fight on a lot of different fronts as the pipeline struggle wore down. Like things in the city of Hamilton have gotten really intense in terms of gentrification and just skyrocketing rates of both rent and also poverty. So that's been like a big focus in recent years. But yeah, I still take a lot of my inspiration and try to engage in as much solidarity as I can with a lot of the pipeline stuff that's going on. I think if I had to point to somebody right now who I think really like encapsulates a lot of like what I wish there were more of in the world, it would be like Canna House and like the Tiny House Warriors. I really love everything that she brings, the struggle, and I love her attitude, and yeah, that's someone that I take a lot of inspiration from these days. And more recently, these like graded warriors, these like younger people that have stepped up to kind of like forward that struggle and have been taking a lot of risks. So yeah, there's a lot of inspiration still out there.
Thank you. I really that's very diverse in terms of experience and where the and where those moments come that provide like openings, even though it may not necessarily seem like it at the time. So one thing that I find interesting, and again we'll go back to Jen, and people can jump in however you might like, is so in listening to Jaydene and Sakej, is that so they're off, and then they come back into the territory or to Saskatchewan to family. But you were kind of on the land, but then you go out into this bigger, like into the bigger movement. I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that, but the other thing that I thought might be also interesting to reflect on is kind of the connection between, because I find in the climate, for lack of a better word, climate change world, the climate change dialogue world, the climate change, whatever, like to me, there's just such like there's a lot of decolonizing there that has to happen around how we even talk about that. So it's like, okay to say climate change, maybe people can deal with that. But when you start saying climate justice, when you start saying climate action, when you start talking about the racism within the movement, when you start talking about the inequity and the justice, who's impacted, who's getting to ask the questions, whose voices get heard. Yeah, I just sort of wanted to, get an understanding of your reflection of that, and how being a land defender of communities and relatives, because people talked about like relatives, like my uncle influenced me, and then my grandmother and my family, my tiny house movement folks. Like, how does that translate into this bigger realm of climate justice or climate change? Because I think the way I kind of it's so big that I find it really hard to like wrap my head around it and think about what can I do to kind of move things in a way that, and I like how Sakej put this, like when you're not on the fence anymore, how can I be on the right side of history? Like how can I be that ancestor that did the right thing, and how do you know it's the right thing? So just I know that's a lot, but what you said was so rich. Those were so many thoughts that were going through my head as you were sharing, and thank you for that. Like how that translates kind of in that way, and how these voices that are here need to kind of influence and kind of challenge and decolonize that the way people talk about this and the way that they think about it, and how they think if we just pass this law or have this policy, everything will be fine. But from what I've heard, that hasn't worked out so well, and so other kind of things need to be done in order to kind of push and get us on the right side of history and move us towards ideally a future that respects and supports all life. So just, I know that's kind of big, but I'm sure probably like me, you have all these little thoughts, like these thoughts going through your head, and about how to put it together. But I think a lot of people are in that view. Like there's so many perspectives. It's like, how do I move? How can I influence this in a way that's going to hopefully make a difference? Jen, did you want to start? I know I'm being really abstract, waving my hands around and throwing these words around. That's just, in my world, that's what I'm finding. Like, it's just, how do we say this in a way that like gets to the root of the matter, as opposed to talk about it so abstract that people feel connected to it.
So I wanted to share that, how I understand my own role in that, in shifting the conversation. within the climate world in Canada, let's say. And I'm a settler. I'm a non-Indigenous person. So that's a specific role. So I really, the book is called, More Powerful Together, Conversations with Climate Activists and Land Defenders. And through my years of working on this research, I've come to see how deeply problematic it is for settlers to be doing any kind of writing or speaking that somehow can be interpreted as being on behalf of Indigenous people. So I do not claim to do that. How I'm trying to understand my role is it being a settler speaking to other settlers about the deep need for us to unlearn our worldviews based on extractivism, exploitation, and oppression, and learn from other non-settler folks about different ways of understanding relations, different ways, and then letting that inform how we organize. So the book starts out with a story of the march in Montreal in September 27th, 2019, which is a huge march of 500,000 people. And it was amazing by all accounts. It was such a success. But then I write about how when I went home that afternoon after the march was over and saw all these social media posts coming up from Indigenous folks who had been there, part of youth delegations, etc., talking about huge amounts of anti-Indigenous racism that happened in the climate march. And so I see my role as raising up that problem, making sure the settlers in the climate movement understand that that's happening and actively fight against it. Because I really believe that we can't have strong movements while we continue to have relations of sexism, racism, classism, etc. For many reasons. So many of the people I spoke to in the interviews for the book named that these and actually when I interviewed Sakej, do you mind if I tell the story? At the time I was thinking, oh, there's a lot of tensions in the movement. Do you remember that? I was like, people have a lot of tensions about their theories of change or their end goals. We're always debating what's up with that. How do we solve that? And Sakej challenged me to look deeper than that. And do you mind if I read a quote?
Sure.
He said, it's not enough to recognize, and this is on page 150 of the book, it's not enough to recognize that there are different doctrines, end goals, or theories of change. A better part of the analysis is why people chose those. They choose them not based on merit, they choose them based on preservation of self-interest. The tensions that exist aren't usually based on the relative merits of different approaches to change, they're based on people's biases and self-interest. And these biases are the real roots of tensions within our movements. So I thought about that really hard for a long time, and I'm still thinking about that and what it looks like to unlearn those biases, to really question self-interest, and what it looks like for settlers like myself within the movements, within research, to learn how to share power, just like relinquish the power, wealth, and land that I have due to being born a settler in a settler colonial country, and what that looks like and how you do that in life, but also in our movement spaces. So that's how I position myself. And there's lots of reflections on it in the book. And but I have to say that I feel like these conversations, which maybe weren't happening as much 5 years ago, seem to be happening more and more in the movements, including here in Quebec. There is a youth movement that's working really hard to teach the older people in the movement in Quebec about what anti-racism looks like, what decolonizing movements look like. So I feel like a lot's shifting and changing, largely due to the leadership of folks like Sakej and Jaydene who have been speaking up and leading these conversations for a long time and giving trainings. And so I want to give some gratitude there.
I think people can learn a lot from your approach. Like I have to say that a lot of the times for me, there's a big cringe factor. Like, when people say, oh, I'm an ally, and I'm like, really? Because sometimes our allies betrayed us. Like we have a history of that. But I really appreciate the self-reflective component to it, and that just transparency and honesty and how you talk about that. And any of my students are listening, like I really ask them to dig deep into that. Like, what is your motivation? Because Indigenous people have every right to say, who are you anyway, and why are you interested in it? It's like your intention. Because people have come in with maybe good intentions, but it kind of went sideways. So I do want to say I appreciate that, and that honesty, and that recognition that I'm still growing and I'm still learning, and my and that your engagement with Sakej and Jaydene has continued. It's not like, okay, bye, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Like, my research is done, because that happens way too much. And before I turn it over to Sakej to speak to already what I've forgotten about was my original question is, I have this fantasy, of, because so many times I'm on a panel, and probably the same might happen to you, or you're in these spaces where you have to speak on behalf of all Indigenous people. I'm like, well, that's impossible for me to do. And what do we need to do to decolonize and to be anti-racist? And then, but really my fantasy has been, can I have a panel of like all these people who have all this power and have a voice that's united to so many people, and you lay out a 10-point plan about what you're going to do. Like, what are you going to let go of? Are you going to let go of that self-interest? Are you going to let go of that ego? Are you going to let go of that power? I haven't seen a panel like that. And then seen the follow-up, like, that it's usually like, hey, let's get Indigenous people up there. Maybe they're the last person to speak about what needs to be done, but not really where people look inward and just say, this is what I'm going to do. This is actually what I'm giving up. That's hard, right? So anyway, I just thought I'd share this fantasy panel that I hope happens sometime. Like, I want to hear, what are you going to do about anything I just said? So appreciate your honesty and transparency, Jen. So Sakej, did you want to just kind of share your thoughts on?
Yeah, sure. I agree. That would be a great fantasy panel, like, to be able to talk in that way, right? Because it really kind of digs deep into a lot of people's motivations, even maybe create some self-awareness as to why people do it. That's great. Jen, you set me up for a perfect segue. So thank you. So to speak on that, this idea that people get involved, at least is my experience, people get involved in resistance action, not generally because we all say, there's the bad guy, let's all come together and work against this bad guy. I think there's a lot of self-interest that's involved. And I could go through all kinds of typologies as to what does the Indigenous ally look like. We come across like the white savior and such, and there's all these personal motivations that really set the framework and boundary around how they're going to think about strategies and goals. Because a lot of times, particularly, I'll give you, on a more extreme side, if you're the white savior, you don't necessarily see yourself as relinquishing power, authority, decision-making to Indigenous people, because you want to play the role of the decision maker and the authority to be that white savior. So I've encountered all these different biases and self-interest that motivate why people are involved in action. And I want to link this back to what you're saying, Deborah, about kind of where people approach climate crisis from. And I think in very, I don't want to say oversimplified, but kind of simplified way of looking at this. I'm going to step back to the 80s and 90s, where people involved in Indigenous resistance, we see activists, Indigenous activists, and Indigenous warriors as two different things, right? And from the activist point of view, I could say, to put a really kind of general title, I could say they're more like reformist. They're looking for a change in the system. And that's, like, you're looking for that very, specific piece of legislation. You're looking for the government to produce a new policy. You're looking for a new relationship or a new department to spring up to deal with these problems, right? And that's more of a reformist approach. Whereas for a long time, Indigenous resistance, at least on the warrior side of things, were about revolution, meaning a change of the system, not in the system. So there's a lot of tension for a long time between Indigenous reformists and Indigenous revolutionaries that still kind of, it still bleeds over today, but not so much as, say, 20, 25, 30 years ago. But I think we could still look at people involved in climate crisis in the same way. Those that have some kind of interest in maintaining the status quo. So if I was a colonizer, a settler coming into Canada, I still may want Canada as a nation state to exist. I still may want the energy corporations, heavily modified and transferred maybe to alternative energy sources to exist. Because in the end, I still want some kind of Western concept of industrial society to exist. I have a vested interest in seeing that happen, right? To me, those that come to this resistance that have those kind of goals are the reformists, right? They're still looking to maintain the system in some way, to change it, reshape it, but still maintain that system. Whereas now, Indigenous activism, resistance, and those that pursue like Indigenous nationhood are being repositioned now as a bigger group, as the revolutionaries, that we see it that way. Because if we see reformism more as those existing within this kind of structure, Western structure that exists, the revolutionaries would be the ones that completely and utterly oppose it, that want to see a complete change of that. And really what we're going down to is a change of industrial society. And the only other ones that seem to have some kind of goals or strategies or ideas around what does it look to exit that industrial society would be Indigenous people around the world. They have not only a goal, but they have a complete construct around structure, governance, culture, a way of life that positions the alternative to what does industrial society look like. So I would say we could kind of use these labels of reformist and revolutionary to look at where are you? Are you a reformist in this climate change kind of fight? Or are you a revolutionary that's seen this more as a climate crisis that we have to completely come up with radical strategies, that minor changes are really not going to be far-reaching enough to impact the changes we need now? We're not going to see that. Right? So we can look at it that way, and then we could ask ourselves, how do we relate to each other? How do we assist and support each other, knowing that we have certain people have certain limitations as far as they'll go based on their vested interest or their ideology. Right? And we have to find this to be able to work together in some way or another. For me, I think my particular role, helping out with Warrior Societies, puts me on the far side of the idea of revolutionary. Because obviously Warrior Societies are about rebuilding Indigenous nations, not alongside the colonizer, not in partnership with the colonial system, but to restore the power, the authority, the governance of Indigenous nations, communities, and the way we've done things. And it just so happened in the last couple of decades that we see that aligning with the climate crisis, in the sense that those who really do the analysis see that industrial society is the problem, and we have to exit that system and hopefully come out with something else. And that's where Indigenous nationhood kind of becomes the solution for what industrial society was. So my role has been about empowering that as best I can.
I love that. I think like one of the ways that we can come back to it, but just something to think about. Kyle White, who's someone I admire a lot, Potawatomi scholar, he recently talked about like the climate crisis is actually a crisis in relationships. Because like trying to focus on the techno fix, trying to like even how we understand it, right? So I was talking about, like, again, this idea around terminology. Is it action? Is it justice? Is it change? Like, do we want to say crisis? Because that implies certain things, right? It means we need to do something, like there's a turning point. And so he talked about it as a crisis in relationships. Yes, we can, but, and then thinking about how do we move forward? How do we move forward from that particular place? I think that particular piece, I haven't read or talked to him since then, but I really wanted to brain about that a little bit more, and just going, okay, now that we know that, what do we do? I'm sure he's come up with one. I kind of read that piece, and I don't know if he's ever going to be listening, but he could. Maybe I'll say, listen to this. Sort of felt like he kind of had it, right? Like he'd been giving advice. This is what needs to happen. This is what, settlers need to do. They need to actually recognize that there's a thing called colonialism that permeates a lot, and capitalism, and like what you talked about. And he was a bit frustrated and said, look, this is kind of a big part of the problem. But a lot of the times when I look at the actual definition of how people are defining what the problem is that we're facing, like in the IPCC reports, it's very technical. And I'm not saying that's not true, like it's true. There's a whole bunch of other things that are true too, right? That you talked about, that Jen talked about, and people kind of don't want to go there. Like they don't want to go there and name it. And maybe we don't have all the words yet to name it. Like how do we name all these things? You know, because a lot of the vocabulary kind of develops over time. But anyway, those are just some things that I thought about, was this piece that he wrote on what we're talking about here is a crisis in relationships, and the techno fix probably isn't going to get us there. That's not, it'll no doubt tweak and help, but that's not the transformation that's actually required. So thank you. Jaydene, any thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like yeah, going off what you said, I think over the years I involved in all sorts of different actions. It, you know, reading theory on you know, what's wrong with capitalism and the system of capitalism, and what's wrong with you know, colonialism, and how did we get here and the history of it and all that. That's all been very formative, but nothing's really been more formative than like actually having to continuously interact with like the criminal justice system, or with the courts, or with like the state generally, and realizing just how like criminal it all is, and watching, you know, friends go to jail, watching the repression that inevitably comes down on communities after they like attempt to resist this incredibly profitable system for the government of Canada and those in the business community that help to run it. And I think over the years it was those experiences more than the theories that really led me to develop not only an anti-capitalist politic, but also like an anti-state politic. And in looking around at like who I wanted to be organizing with, you know, it's like sometimes I'm organizing with Indigenous community, either at Six Nations or at Chippewa, the Thames, where my Sundance ceremony family is. But a lot of the times it's just in Hamilton, you know, or it's in Montreal, or wherever it might be. And I did take a hard look around and think to myself, like, who here independently has their own critique of the state? Who here independently is looking for revolution and not reform? You know, and you can get kind of technical. I won't get too much into it now, but I mean, even just the differences between anarchism and communism, you know, or a state communism, that whose end goals are to eventually seize power of the state, you know, but not to dismantle it. I really dove pretty deep into the like kind of Western political theories that different people in the movements were engaging in. And for me, it just like ended up at anarchism. And it also felt like to me like the most compatible parallel system that maybe settlers could actually embrace, that would in the end produce the kind of outcome that would allow for like true reconciliation between settlers and Indigenous people. Because like I obviously don't think that's at all possible now, nor am I interested in it or interested in talking about it as a real thing. But any sort of solution to the climate crisis, or to any of the multitude of crises that we're facing, if the solution is to maintain the Canadian state in its current form, and its monopoly over power and of force and of land and of all these things, it necessitates an industrial society to function that way. And I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in seeing a return to like autonomous, small, decentralized communities that are living off the land, you know, making decisions together, that are living according to what the land can provide them that they live on. And there's a lot of different changes and a lot of things I could talk about in terms of like what I think that vision of the future looks like. But if from any direction you look at it, it is going to entail radical change. There is no reformist strategy that's going to get us to a place I think that would see human beings living on the land and living here in any sort of like social peace with each other. And, you know, this is a hot thing going back and forth, and I know some people have feelings about it, but I don't personally believe it's reasonable to assume that Europeans or settlers are going to get back on the boat and go back to Europe, you know. So I'm more interested in like figuring out like what politic I can put forward to be like, everything you guys have produced here is complete garbage and it's ruining everything, and you need to find a way that's not appropriative of Indigenous tradition, that doesn't assume that you're going to somehow like win your way into Indigenous community by like serving the movement or something like that, but like actually look around at each other and figure out like, how do you want to organize yourselves? How can you organize yourselves in a different way that's going to be respectful of the land and of the planet? And to a large extent, like I do believe that like, so that revolutionary perspective of like challenging the state, it is going to come from settlers, or it has to, right? I think Indigenous people have like the double duty of trying to like at once rebuild their communities and just maintain their communities for those of us that haven't really like lost those governance systems or ways of relating to the land or ceremony. But you know, settlers don't have those things, and I think that the very first thing they need to do is to like make sure that the system that they're benefiting from, that their ancestors helped create, is like taking the boot off of the neck of Indigenous people and of the land, quite frankly. And so like in the climate justice movement, there's lots of Indigenous heroes, right? And you always have to kind of look around and see like which Indigenous movements and which people are being held up by the movement. And this is not to say that I don't support Frida, or that I didn't put my all into trying my best to offer solidarity to the struggle of Unist'ot'en or the Wet'suwet'en people generally. But when I look around at like the ways in which that struggle and those people were so much more palatable to like Western media and to the donor base of these big climate justice organizations, rather than someone like Canna House, who instead is like posting, you know, Instagram photos of her just like giving the middle finger and being like, fuck the police, like, you know, and like doing all this stuff. She's not very like packageable, and her approach is very uncompromising. And you look at, you know, even this latest struggle at 1492 Landback Lane, just next door to where I am now, and you look at the way in which the climate justice movement, you know, I mean, if you want to compare it to the way that they held up the Wet'suwet'en struggle, I mean, categorically just ignored it, right? Because to them, again, it's also that like self-serving thing, like, well, Indigenous land defense is something the climate justice movement wants to hold up when they feel as though those Indigenous people are putting their lives on the line for the climate, which benefits them as well. But when it's Indigenous people trying to defend a chunk of land that would benefit them and their children and their grandchildren and whatever, but maybe potentially wouldn't do much to actually mitigate climate change, all of a sudden the support isn't there, you know? Or when those land defenders that are out there are 20-something Mohawk, you know, or like Haudenosaunee boys who have balaclavas on and who are, you know, chucking rocks at police cars and setting tire fires. Again, you know, you don't see the support from the climate justice movement. And so I think that when we are looking at like who the allies are or whatever it is, I think everything this was said is exactly right. Like you have to look at their biases and their motivations and look at who they're supporting and why. And if the people, if those organizations are only supporting Indigenous peoples that are like easily packageable, or who are fighting for things that are also benefiting settlers, then I tend to write them off, you know, because I'm like, this is a self-serving thing that you're doing, and they're also like engaging in a strategy in which they're attempting to like, yeah, pass policy reform and appeal to like a mass base of Canadians in a way that still allows them to remain comfortable. And the facts of the matter is like they just can't be comfortable anymore if there's going to be enough change to actually reconcile a relationship with the land and with Indigenous people, quite frankly. Yeah, that's all I have to say, I guess.
There's about 400 things I would just love to follow you up on. Yeah. But it's something else that my son and I had noticed, like very, like what you call the packageable Indigenous heroes. Like it all looks like a photo shoot, right? Like you're just thinking, okay, that's pretty contrived, but yeah, but it's, yeah, but I think, yeah, it feels like there's just so many parts, and then how do you create some kind of coherence from it that's actually going to, you know, generate this trans. It's almost like from what I can see, or maybe it's just in some cases the scientists. When I think about the IPCC report, the 1.5, well, they all say transformation needs to happen, or the IPBS report, and I don't remember what the whole acronym means, the one on biodiversity and animals and wildlife, like a million extinct species. Again, they're all saying transformation, 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 but what is what is that then? And what scale does that need to happen on, and what role can we play in there? I was one of the things I've started to think about, because I worry a little bit about young people and what future kind of do they see for themselves, and how do they think we're going to get there? Like, what can a self-determined climate future kind of look like, and what does that involve? And as a mom, and you know, an auntie and adult, everything else, I think about what can I do to try to support that. And to some extent, Sakej sort of focused a little bit on that, in terms of, okay, the culture and the language that forms the foundation of that. Like I look at it as, that's the foundation of it. Like, it's probably not going to come from these other spaces that you pointed out, Jaydene. Like, so that was similar to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People report. The findings just said any policy in relation to Indigenous people's been wrong. Like, and that probably we can say it really hasn't changed all that much, really. So where does that change kind of need to happen? Like, what do we have some degree of, for lack of a better word, control over? Like, what are the things that we can do? As Jaydene kind of pointed out, maybe people don't see how that's going to benefit. Like for Anishinaabe, like generally we want to make decisions that's going to support all life at all the scales. Like, you know, so probably other people are going to benefit if we do that. So what are some of the things that can look like? I know that's kind of a big question, but it's something that I'm really focusing on, because I'm, you know, concerned about it. But at the same time, I'm also hopeful. Like, I think there's a lot that young people can do. I think there's actually a lot that we can still do, because I think that my belief is that Indigenous peoples have thousands and thousands of years of knowledge that have enabled us to be here and even have this conversation, and thousands of years of knowledge and governance systems and laws that can contribute in ways that people can't even imagine, right? And so that's a bit of where my focus is. What are they, and how do we get them in a place where they can start to have kind of an influence, even in our own lives at whatever kind of level, right? So, but at the same time, we're starting to get questions. So if you just wanted to maybe have a brief comment on that, maybe what I'll do is start with Sakej on that. Sakej, sorry.
Sorry.
Mix up the little circle thing I see in front of me here. Mix it up.
I'm trying to think how to approach that. Maybe actually, I'm just getting my thoughts together. Jaydene, you have something to speak about first as I kind of assemble my thoughts?
Can you just rephrase the question so that I have it in my mind? I was reading the chat questions.
Yeah. What kind of, you know, an Indigenous self-determined future can look like? I think we kind of already know that the broader climate change movement is its own thing, but an Indigenous one, and there's obviously going to be diversity within that because Indigenous peoples, nations, societies are very diverse. But what can that kind of look like? Like, where's the hope in that we could convey to young people? You know, we can have that kind of influence. You probably are having that kind of influence, but where is that kind of hope? What is that self-determined Indigenous future going to look like? Or what could it look like? What can we do? You can answer this. You should be really winning a Nobel Prize because that's like the big question.
Yeah, I mean, it's really tough. I mean, it's tough to answer that as someone who even hopes to be a mother in the next years, and like I've even asked that question to myself, you know, of like, what am I really bringing a child into this world to have or something, or to hope for? And you know, it's tricky. And I mean, I'm gonna answer this, but I'm gonna just preface that by saying that sometimes this answer doesn't come across as very like optimistic or something. But I do generally feel as though, you know, okay, I've spent a lot of time, especially in ceremony community, having a lot of conversations, or at least listening to a lot of elders talk about how we don't need to be like fighting back against colonialism. We just need to be like revitalizing our communities, continuing our ceremonies, and doing and relearning our life ways. And it's never sat that well with me when I hear that, and it often reminds me of a lot of things I've read from mostly elders speaking both in the past and in the present, of this kind of idea that like all we need to do is like outlast them, you know, them settlers. So we just need to outlast colonial capitalism, and as long as we still have our life waves, then like we will still be able to survive. And I guess something in that has never sat quite well with me. And there's a book called Wasase, I think, maybe I'm saying it wrong, written by Alfred Sakej. It's a Mohawk man, and in it he almost like outlines his idea of like an Indigenous anarchism or something close to that, or something related to that. And it took me a little while when I was reading it to really like figure out, but yeah, his if I'm not getting it wrong, you know, his premise is also that like Indigenous people shouldn't be spending our time attacking the colonial state and going on the offensive, but that we also shouldn't shy away from using force or even violence, like in self-defense. And he kind of puts forth a more like militant or like warrior like solution to winning sovereignty. And I think that it is true in my general feelings that this like beast of like industrial society or capitalist colonialism is like, there's no existing peacefully beside it. You know, I mean, the thing about the state I sometimes talk to people about is like, people are like, well, it's like, you know, this thing that's kind of like a collection of individuals. It's not its own entity or like this. And I'm like, well, have you ever tried to opt out of it? Have you ever tried to say, I actually don't want to be a Canadian. I don't want to have citizenship here. I don't want those things. It's actually, you can't do that, right? You have to be a member of a state somewhere. Even Canada even considers Indigenous people that live here to be Canadian, like in all, you know, wards of the Canadian state at least, or whatever it might be. And I think the logic of the nation state has encompassed the globe to the sense that it is a challenge in and of itself to that framework and to industrial society to declare yourself like autonomous of that, or to say like I desire to live free and alone, you know, as hard as it might be. And so I think generally like what I actually think is maybe the like most hopeful vision of the future I have is one in which like kind of the hypocrisies and contradictions of capitalism continue to reveal themselves to settlers, and more of them, which I actually do believe is happening, although maybe very slowly, kind of go away from that reformist attitude and over to exploring revolutionary alternatives that look as though they might actually start to really challenge the authority of the state in like larger ways. And simultaneously that Indigenous people can like form like connections with those movements in ways that is like relevant or appropriate, but also that they and communities might begin to feel it possible or feel inclined to kind of liberate zones in North America or on Turtle Island, you know, much like the Zapatistas did in Mexico. You know, by going into the mountains and going into the hills and the places in which they knew that the Mexican state didn't have a direct interest in, they managed to buy themselves years and years to form like very resilient communities, though not perfect communities, and still communities that have to interact with capitalism and globalization in various ways, and make sacrifices in that sense. But my kind of most hopeful vision for the future would be to see things like that happen here. And I think Canada is actually like maybe fairly like well positioned of a place for those kinds of things to happen, because there's just like so much land, and settlers have never really successfully like wielded control over all of it. Like they like to like the mythology of the nation state is that they somehow do control and monitor all of the land that is Canada, but like in reality they have no ability to do that. And like over half of the population of all of Canada lives like in the GTA, which is like this tiny small pocket of land at the very like bottom of it, and the rest of it remains like fairly unpopulated. And so I think that like my unoptimistic view of this is that kind of things are just going to have to get worse before they get better. Like I think Canadians are still like settlers are still just like too comfortable, like very, very comfortable in what's happening. And also that like climate change is just not going to affect them the way it's going to affect other people in other parts of the world for a very long time, probably. And so I think that Indigenous people continuing to like revitalize their lifeways and to rebuild warrior societies, frankly, and to like strengthen those capacities as well, are the things that we need to do to kind of seize the opportunity when it arises to kind of like create our own autonomy. Maybe that's outside of, you know, the reservation land that people have, you know, like yeah, maybe that looks like taking bold steps to go north in some places, or to go to places where they haven't like historically lived. But I don't know. I don't really know, you know? Yeah, don't give me the Nobel Peace Prize, because I have no idea. These are just like wild conjectures, really, of like ways in which I think that might be possible one day. So.
Very humble. You won't accept the Nobel Peace Prize.
To be honest, with all the people that they've given the Nobel Peace Prize to, especially in this industry, like I actually just like wouldn't want it anyway. It's a weird lineage to be a part of.
Ajay?
Okay. Thank you, Jaydene. You allowed me to organize my thoughts and get more focused on this, and you hit on a lot of things I want to say too. Actually, appreciate that. The way to approach this, I just took down a couple of notes, is this idea of, I hear this reoccurring kind of theme. How do we approach this crisis? One is, and probably a lot of us have done it, is the idea of isolation. As Indigenous people, we're pushed out of those spaces anyway. We're pushed out of places that have anything to do with power, decision-making, authority. So when you think about resistance to industrial society, when you think about environmental movements and those involved in climate change, there is a pushing out of the Indigenous concepts, ideas, and voice and presence. So isolation becomes a what feels like some kind of solution for us. Let's just remove ourselves from that fight. Let's remove ourselves from that resistance. Let's live in our own way. We'll stay in our own communities or our own small pockets of groups, and we'll just try to live like that. Well, that would be nice if we didn't think about the next 7 generations, right? And to me, you know, I'm just being frank about it. It's selfish to me, right? Because I'm just more concerned about how am I going to live out my life within this crisis without thinking about how do I change that crisis to set up a better world for my children and grandchildren, or right? So then that says, if I'm not going to pursue the approach of isolation, even if I'm being forced in that direction, what about engagement? And what does that look like? What does an Indigenous engagement look like in the resistance against industrial society and colonialism? And I think if I could pose 2 possible visions, or not visions, but just ideas, they seem to be almost opposites. And you know, they're really more metaphoric than they are literal. But if I say the idea of utopian versus dystopian, right? And if I was to say that, let me talk about the dystopian for a moment, because it seems like that's where we're going. The dystopian future will be the future of the path we're on, where industrial society maintains power, maintains its ways, and it continues to ravage and destroy the natural world around us. Are we prepared for that? We're putting so much effort and strategies into resistance, which is valid. We do need to do that. But I think equally, if you think about next generations, we also have to think about strategies for defeat. What if we don't win and this dystopian future comes into effect? Have we thought about what do post ecological collapse skills and tactics look like? What happened when we live in a place where everything natural is falling apart on us? What kind of skill sets do you need to have to survive in that kind of very dystopian world? And I don't know how many people are really kind of addressing that. I mean, we have a lot of hope for this more utopian kind of framework of what a future might look like. But hope is not a strategy, right? It's the absence of strategy. We need to have strategies that address these things, and we need to have, I hate to bring this militaristic thinking in, but the way we used to address it was we have an acronym called PACE. You have a primary, an alternate, a contingency, and an emergency strategy for any kind of course of action. You never have one strategy, you have these 4, right? So if our primary strategy is to create this kind of utopian future, good, we invest our time and resources, and that becomes our number 1 course of action we're trying to achieve. Then we have an alternative, which means like, if the first one didn't work, what's my backup plan to continue to make that goal work? But then once you hit contingency and emergency planning, that's when you're saying, what happens if my plan and my efforts are completely failing? The worst case scenario is happening. Am I prepared for that? Or am I completely caught off guard and it's a completely utter defeat and there's nothing I could do, right? So I think we have to think about these 2 different worlds, like these futures, because they're very much now possibilities. I don't think there's so much going to be a future that fits in the middle between this utopian and this dystopian futures. I think we've got past that point. We're really seeing it where this crossroad, it's going to move in one of 2 directions. So strategies that around how do we create this more, and I'm saying more because utopian is a very much an ideal, it's a concept of perfection, right? I'm not really talking about that kind of fantasy world, but how to create the best possible society that we can. That's what I mean by this utopian future, right? Well, obviously in the Americas, I'm really talking about how do we reposition Indigenous people to be in charge of their land again. And English is problematic because the words are so carry Western thought. So when I say in charge, I don't mean this in the constructs of nation state and centralized governance and things. But how is it that we have the responsibilities to take care of the land and next 7 generations? How do we create an environment, an operational environment that repositions Indigenous people as the ones in charge of that? Colonial society has a huge problem with that, because the minute you have that dialogue and you say, I want a future where Indigenous people are now in charge again, watch that dialogue break down. Because then suddenly you're talking about a future where Indigenous people are the decision makers. Suddenly white colonial interest is at stake. And then to give up that kind of power and privilege and luxury that comes with it, it's a very hard future for settlers to envision, where they're not the ones that have power and decision, right? But there was a time where, you know, this was a fantasy. You couldn't talk about Indigenous people in charge of the land or in charge of the resistance. You couldn't do that. But I think one of the, I hate to say it this way, but one of the benefits of the climate crisis is, I think people are starting to see things in such an extreme way that perhaps they're starting to say, you know what, we're running out of options. We're running out of courses of action. And perhaps maybe those Indigenous people might have some solutions here, possible, right? And I think that dialogue is starting to happen, but really the hurdle to that being a realization is self-interest and racism, right? Because I feel that obviously settler society has the dominance over the constructs of power and resources and the ability to apply so much time and effort to any kind of problems. And then when you have these dialogues, and I've literally had these dialogues with people who said, you mean you want the Indigenous people in power? Like completely. And they would say, isn't that racist? I'm like, wait a minute, you're very comfortable with white people in power. What is so wrong with the idea of Indigenous people being in power of their own lands and their own territories? Why is that such a problem? Why is it so problematic, right? Then you have all the kind of the stereotypical, well, you know, you don't have governance on the res that well. And then, you know, all the racist stereotypes kick in. Like most of the time you hear about, oh, well, you know, you spend too much time drinking and partying and drugging and poverty. You can't handle a nation. These things still kind of like they're pervasive in a lot of people's thinking. So the idea of Indigenous people in charge of their own territory becomes problematic because of those white racial stereotypes, right? But if we could somehow, it's not even us. I don't think Indigenous people even have the power to convince settler society that we need to be the ones that are legitimately empowered again to take care of our own territories. I think it's going to come down to a question of self-interest. Has the problem got so bad that settler society finally says, you know what? I can see my own demise happening now, or if not, at least my next generation's demise. Okay, I'm almost ready to relinquish power in some way to have you fix our problem, basically, right? And I don't think we've got that far yet, but I know it sounds bleak, but I honestly don't see like a transformation or a transfer of power to Indigenous people leading a resistance with the goals of rebuilding Indigenous nations until we're on the doorstep of oblivion before it gets to that point, right? So it's unfortunate, but as Jaydene said, I really don't think things are gonna get better till they actually kind of get worse first before we'll get to that point.
Yeah, if I could just run on that for one quick second is, yeah, like I totally agree. And I think that's a real possibility. And I think the other possibility is that things are just going to get so bad for the settler state that they're gonna lose the ability to attempt to control all of the territory that they control now, right? And they'll have to pull back in order to protect their institutions and their real population centers, right? And in that, there may be opportunity to take back land or to go and like develop like our own systems of autonomy or governance over territories that they just like can no longer really physically control. Yeah.
Absolutely, I entirely agree. And we need to ask ourselves, are we preparing for those moments where climate crisis could be seen, in effect, like an ally? As Indigenous people, we haven't assembled enough power to destabilize the nation state. But are we encountering a moment where the nation state's power becomes vulnerable to the chaos that climate crisis can present to it? And in that moment of vulnerability, before it goes back and reorganizes, reconsolidates power, do we have the strategies in place to engage those moments of weakness for the nation state to exasperate and build on those destabilization kind of conditions that a nation state will encounter at this time, right? And that will be the contingency and emergency planning which you do within strategies to be able to seize those moments, because nature, in effect, is presenting itself as an ally in its own moments of weakness and hurt as it's going through this climate crisis itself. It's presenting itself as a powerful ally in the ability to take on the power of empires. But are we stepping up and fulfilling the responsibilities, developing the strategies and preparations to seize that very small window before things just completely go bad? Are we ready to do that? And have we been getting ourselves ready? So yeah, I entirely agree.
You're probably blowing everybody's minds away at the moment, but what else? What I'll say before turning it over to Jen for some summary comments, and you could probably read in the chat what some of the, we won't be able to address all of them in the next little while, is I think about history and actually our own stories where we've had to face our own destruction before, and usually because of bad things happening to the planet. And Anishinaabe have lots of stories like that. There's so much, like, it's so rich what you've said. It's just, there's work that we need to do, but there's so much more work that needs to happen in broader settler society. There needs to be those, like those cracks that Jaydene talked about, where people are like, this is so not working. Like, really, we like, you know, and we can't do that. Like, we can point it out, but, you know, really, quite frankly, Indigenous peoples have been pointing that out for centuries, really. You know, like we're just going to be saying what, you know, basically our ancestors have said and our grandparents have said and our parents have said. And yeah, so there's a lot of work that needs to happen there. And again, going back to Kyle White, as he just said, we've had to do it before. We've had to face our annihilation before, like not only like in stories that I've talked about, but also as part of colonization and genocide, right? Like we've come out the other side. So maybe we know some things. You know, we just sort of have to figure out and mobilize it to address what we're saying. But there's just so much work that others have to do to change in order for that to happen. Yeah, so appreciate that. Yeah, I imagine you're probably blowing a lot of people's minds. They're just like, oh no, what do I do with that? Jen, are you able to figure out what people can do with that? We went for that because that's what we need. You need to have these really difficult, challenging conversations that do blow people's minds away, because obviously what we're doing based on what we're acting upon isn't enough. So we need to have these like other kind of conversations and this other kind of knowledge coming into the fore, right? That they can't just be on the sides and in the margins or not heard, I guess would be what I'd worry about. Like, we need to hear different perspectives. Yeah, do you have anything you want to add? Or
yeah, maybe it's just so I'm listening and I'm learning, and that's been blowing my mind and definitely taking the conversation that started in the book to a whole new level. And so thank you to both of you so much for illuminating those things. And while you were speaking, I was really feeling the power of Indigenous leadership in a revolutionary change. And I was thinking about the role of settlers as the supporting roles, not the stars of the movie. And it brought me back to something Sakej talked to me about in our long interview for the book, where he talked about settlers learning that we're not the hero in the story. Maybe sometimes we're actually the villain, and learning what that feels like, and that. But if you're shifting the story and realizing Indigenous folks, as we've been talking about, have these incredible alternatives that offer powerful solutions to the climate crisis, to industrialism, to capitalism, that it just means learning what it means to play the supporting role in that movie, the movie of that or that story. And I feel like a lot of people are not comfortable with that, but actually I think it's an important role too. The support needs to be there, and there's so many ways to do it, right? Like, as a settler, I have so much access to, somebody in university, I have access to so much information. I have so much access to funding that other people don't have. Finding ways to both relinquish power, but at the same time, strategically use access to funnel resources, funnel information, organize whatever, and funnel it to Indigenous leadership. I feel like that's a powerful role. It feels really meaningful to me. I feel like settlers learning to step back and play a supporting role is important, is powerful, and is needed. So it's not. So I feel like what you've been talking about is empowering and hopeful for the future. And I see ways for settlers to support. I just hope that settlers learn to see why that's so necessary. And I feel like really powerful arguments have been made to that today. So thank you.
So it's tricky for me to try to summarize a lot of the comments. Dali's been sharing them from folks who've been listening, but I guess if I were to pull out a common theme is how can the like Indigenous, whatever you want to call it, movement strategies approach, because there's like always more than one, right? How can that align with other movements like the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, anti-racism, anti-patriarchy, like how do you see synergies there? Like people who are also marginalized, not listened to, have a hard time having a voice. I think that's kind of where people are going with their comments. So maybe I'll start with Jaydene, if you have any comments to make on that.
I would just reiterate kind of some of the things I've already said, which is that I think that the common theme that you can find between those movements is simply that capitalism isn't working even for settlers. Like whether that's like racialized folks who have been kind of like sacrificed at the altar of capitalism from the beginning in order to build it up, or even just like poor white folks, you know, or disabled people, or whatever it might be. Like in reality, like the system of capitalism is not working for like a lot of people. And I'll just leave it on a kind of a simple note that I've kind of written about before, which is that in my personal opinion, to be an ally or whatever, or to be in, I'll say to be in solidarity with Indigenous people, you don't have to just show up to the land defense occupation or fundraise for it or be a supporter, right? Like in my opinion, like anything that settlers are doing in order to like weaken the power of the state, to undermine capitalism where they stand and where they are and from their own position, like that is helping Indigenous people, and it's also like helping the land. Like, so it's not just about waiting for Indigenous people to tell you what the right thing to do is or what we need you to do. It's like, no, like look around, like you know, like form these ideas, like form your critiques of the systems that are in place, and do your own work of undermining reformism, and of weakening the power of the state and weakening its legitimacy, either through like argument or action. And any move on those fronts is going to be like a greater gain in the long run. And to be honest, like I like again as an anarchist, like I believe in like decentralized action is actually one of the greatest tools we have against very like centralized state power, because diverse and like multitudinous groups of people working towards the same ends, but not necessarily working like directly together or taking leadership from like one central authority, is actually like a very formidable foe to like a centralized power structure. So kind of embracing those tactics and those strategies, and you know, really fighting from where you stand, and not waiting, doing it now. That's what I.
Thank you, Jaydene. That's a good summary of what you've talked about, and I think good advice for folk. So you don't need people kind of latching onto you as an Indigenous person. It's sort of like you really need to do your own work here.
Yeah, and maybe just further clarify that, like, and it is like I am talking about not just a critique of capitalism, because one thing I should mention is I think that actually a critique of capitalism is like fairly common amongst the left, or at least amongst the climate justice movement, but a critique of like state power is very lacking, I feel like. And in fact, like we've mentioned, like a lot of especially like climate justice movements, I think, are always looking for like solutions from the state. And so I think shifting that and stopping and trying to undermine the mythology that like we can't do things on our own, that like change needs to come from above and needs to be like given to us or something, is also just as important as a critique of capitalism.
I like how you summarize that. Yeah. Sajid?
Yeah, I think I want to build on both what Jen and Jaydene had spoke about. And if you're going to bring in Indigenous groups, resistance groups, and those that would be potential allies, bring them in, how does that work? It does come back to the word that Jen was using, the question of being the supporter, right? And I think I'll reference, or at least not reference, but maybe as a very broad way of seeing the framework on this is, if you look at things like guerrilla warfare strategies, you have what amounts to basically what's termed the combatants, the people that are actually engaged actively in the fight, to the amount of supporters is usually like a 1-to-5 ratio. Meaning for every one combatant, you have 5 supporters. And these are people that do everything from fundraising, bringing supplies, help get the word out, help, as Jenny was saying, help undermine the legitimacy of the state. So for these kind of guerrilla style organizations to exist successfully, you need this like 1-to-5 ratio. We tend to really just see the frontline kind of stars of the movie, the ones that are on the ground doing the fighting, which is good. Like, we do have to acknowledge this. We have to honor people that are willing to make those sacrifices. But we also have to ask ourselves, what does the background look like? The people that are involved in supporting those efforts, and what are their roles and responsibilities in that support, right? Without going too deep into the discussions around strategy, but I could just offer a couple of things around the idea of decentralization that Jaydene was talking about. The approach that could be used, it's just one approach, is as you strategically analyze your very situation. So this could be with Soden, this could be line 3, wherever the situation might be. You're going to have very specific traits and characteristics of that fight that will lend towards a different strategy than another one might be. Okay? So you start by determining what is your strategic situation, what are your goals, and then what kind of tactics you use to get there. From there, we could determine our functions. And then what you do is you start, I'm going to use a military term, you start to create a task force that is tailor suited specifically to the functions of that strategy. And when we start engaging this task forcing, we're really assembling where can supporters fit behind achieving what I call decisive operations. So how do we go about taking frontline resistance people and giving them the necessary supporting functions that will allow them to engage and successfully achieve their mandate, what we call mission statement, within that strategy. So really, from a strategic point of view, you are constantly reassembling, disassembling these different collections of allies and supporters to meet the very specific strategic situation that is going on the ground at that moment in that very specific place. If we, and I'm going to say as leaders or planners, can get in that kind of practice of thinking about how do I reassemble this to meet that specific goal, we will know, it'll jump out at us. Where do these places, these roles exist for supporters to fill in where I need them? I don't want, now I'm just going to give you a hypothetical. If I was an Indigenous leader in the middle of the resistance right on a fight, I don't just want a whole bunch of people there. I don't engage in the tactics of the civil rights movement of the 60s and just hope for numbers. That doesn't work. What I need are people to have specific skills, specific resources, specific ability. I need to be able to tailor those and manage those in a way that leads me towards my strategic objective as effectively as possible. Otherwise, I got a whole bunch of mouths to feed that, in effect, and I don't want to say it in a bad way, almost become a liability because the amount of resources that get eaten up by a whole bunch of people that aren't being task organized to meet those strategic objectives, right? So we have to have a plan in place first so we know where supporters could fit for that specific situation. And every situation is going to be different. So be constantly disassembling and reassembling frontline resistance individuals and supporters to meet the strategic needs of that objective. So and that's how you approach decentralization, is this constant disassembling to meet those specific needs.
Oh, okay, you're still moving. I thought, oh no, did he freeze?
Oh, okay.
It's interesting because it's like a constant movement. Yeah, I'm starting to get a sense of how your brain works. Strategic, I think strategically, but in different kind of ways. Yeah, but always everything is purposeful and thoughtful. But I really like I mean, yeah, again, I don't know if people realize just how the role of supporters have. Yeah, so just how important that is in terms of the work that happens, and not to, yeah, just because they're not like the front line or the photographed people or maybe even the packaged people, as Jaydene would say. But you have to recognize all the people who are kind of supporting behind the scenes. I think like we're already past a little bit of our time, and so I really appreciate that you've joined us and that people have joined us for this afternoon. As you can see, the questions are good. I just tried to, like, in my brain on the spot, try to kind of summarize where people were going with, were kind of interested in and going with their questions. Obviously, a lot of people who are listening are probably, folks who do want to make a difference, who do want to help, who want to be part of, like, moving, like, assemble, disassemble, move, and are people who see cracks in the system and capitalism. So I don't know, Jen, I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about the book and research, because again, it's really rare. Like, imagine you're probably listening going, wow, if I could have brought everyone I talked to together, like in something where we could just like go crazy with ideas, and have like so much energy and everything else. Because clearly, if these were two of the folks that you talked to, but maybe just a little bit, because they clearly, like, their contributions fed into research, which is like, how is that useful and how can that be helpful? Like, how can research bring these kind of voices forward that we need to hear, that we don't often hear, into research, and then how can research hopefully, point out these cracks that Jaydene talked about, or this organizing because transformation usually means it's never the same, right? Like, it's movement, it's change. What does that kind of look like? I don't know if you have any concluding comments, Jen, in terms of the role of research in that.
I just want to name that I made mistakes in this research. Like, when I went to do my ethics approval process, they were like, oh, you want to do research that involves Indigenous activists, so you need to do it anonymously. You need to guarantee that you're going to quote people anonymously, and you're going to protect their privacy. And I was like, yeah, that totally makes sense, because people are out there doing frontline work. That makes sense. And it only occurred to me while writing the book, all these amazing thoughts, strategies, reflections, powerful stuff. It's all associated with my name, and those people's names are not there. So Sakej and Jaydene's names are not in the book. That was a huge mistake. And since then, I learned from that. And now when I do my ethics process for research I do now, I always give the person I'm interviewing the option, do you want your name associated or not? And then let them choose. Of course, it's so obvious now, but I mean, I learned that. So I'm very grateful for these opportunities where the people whose thoughts the book is based on can actually have their face and name and voices associated with those thoughts. So it feels like it's undoing some of that mistake I made. But so there's just such a long history of research being really, really problematic, really extractive, and really, reinforcing the shitty relations that we've been talking about. So, but I think there's so much potential there. But I mean, oh my gosh, it's so difficult. But I mean, there's amazing people doing amazing research out there, including Deborah and all the work you're doing with the IEJ project. And so I think it's so possible, but especially for settlers doing research that has anything to do with communities that are impacted or marginalized, doing it right is next to impossible. So if you're going to do it at all, the project needs to be designed from the beginning through to the end with those people. And if you can't build those relations, don't do that research. So there are some things I know now that I did wrong, but now I know And so I'm doing it differently, but yeah, it's just, there's so much potential to go wrong. So it needs to be from the beginning conceived with and by the people that you want to work with. And if you can't make that happen, don't do it. Okay. Do research instead. Research up. Do research about how the colonial state is messed up. Gather that research. I'm talking about settlers right now. Gather that evidence. Do that research, and that'll be supporting the movements you want to support without having to take people's time, Indigenous people's time. Okay, that's enough.
But Michif-Cree for that, and I'm glad you're able to say what I usually can't say in class: shitty research. But so yeah, and it's true. People make all these what we would call intellectual contributions, but then they often don't get recognized. And I just wanted to also say that because I was keen on the support for Indigenous climate justice and really impressed with the work. Because Jen and I actually met, ironically, on another virtual kind of panel type of situation. I went, wow. And I remember sitting there just going, can you feel this question? Because I think it might be relevant to the research, like better than I could do. So she was really gracious about that. And then I invited her to participate in this because I thought, okay, like really in academic institutions, most of the people that are there are non-Indigenous settlers, and in that there's power and privilege in that, and people are wanting to do research. So I said, well, people need to hear from how Jen's like navigating this, because it's a constant negotiation and navigation and learning and being honest and transparent, which I find really important. When you read about research, you think everything went perfectly, and you're like, no, I don't know, not ever in my experience. So, and the first thing she said was, okay, I want to have people who are part of the research to come and have a voice in this. And I went, yeah, and I thought that was amazing for her to take the initiative. So she did all the work to invite Jaydene and this. So I really appreciate that, because part of the Indigenous Environmental Justice Project, and now looking at climate like what does that look like when it's self-determined by Indigenous peoples, which is the root of what people have talked about, is really trying to bring forward the voices that people don't hear. Like I have the privilege of being in spaces, I can talk, but I really want there to bring other voices and other perspectives that people, that are going to get them to think. They're going to get them to ask questions of themselves and reflect in the way that we talked about that. So that's a big part of what we do. So, and because not everyone can make it, that's one reason why we record. Like I always feel like, how do you make this accessible to people like who are going to think about this and want to follow up on this? So that's one reason that we do, so that it's accessible to others in the best way that I can think of. Probably kind of boring, because I'm kind of boring. I'm a boring academic, but so I do appreciate the time that you took to be involved today. And I think Dali, our technical person, all the students who support this, like anything clever that happens is really because of the students. They have to like manage, they have to manage. And so I really want to acknowledge that. And if you're interested, you can go look at some of the other talks that we've did and symposiums and podcasts on the IEJ website and what else might be coming up. And again, I just can't, I've already taken 50 more minutes than we said we were going to take, but so I appreciate that. And I would tell my students, if you say you're going to be this amount of time, be this amount of time, because people have a nice day they want to attend to. So so with that, it's just Michif-Cree to all of you, like totally awesome. Like all my crazy notes, like these are my notes, right? Like this is what they look like. There's nothing linear about me taking notes and circles and square, like about amazing ideas that gives me a lot of food for thought. So I really want to thank you for coming in, Michif-Cree, for coming in, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And for listeners, yeah, there'll be more opportunities for conversation. It's not like any of this is going away tomorrow. I mean, that we could hope for that, but I don't think so. So these conversations need to continue. And again, with that, I'm starting to babble. So I'm so grateful. That I will wish everyone goodbye and Miigwech, and we'll be following up and and letting you know about what's going on. And please, everyone, enjoy the rest of the day. So Miigwech, everybody. Yeah. Aye.